Hello, I'm your host, Kyrie Douglas, and welcome to Catalyzing Computing, the official podcast of the Computing Community Consortium. The Computing Community Consortium, or CCC for short, is a programmatic committee of the Computing Research Association. The mission of the CCC is to catalyze the computing research community and enable the pursuit of innovative, high-impact research. In this episode of Catalyzing Computing, I sit down with Liz Bradley, the current vice chair of the CCC Council. Liz has been with the Department of Computer Science at the University of Colorado at Boulder since January of 1993. Her current research activities focus on nonlinear dynamics and chaos, as well as scientific computation and AI. In this episode, we discuss nonlinear dynamics, chaos theory in pop culture, and the future for artificial intelligence. This is part 2 of my interview with Liz Bradley. If you haven't heard part 1 yet and would like to, go catch that and come right back. Enjoy. So I saw you also do some work with nonlinear dynamics, and there's something on your website about using that to design computers. So how would that work?
Yeah, so this nonlinear dynamics is the less sexy name for chaos, and it's about, dynamics is about how things change or evolve or grow. Nonlinear has to do with a type of system that is ubiquitous in the universe. A good example for people who are laymen is when your cell phone is running low. Well, first you charge your cell phone to 100%, and it takes a long time to go down to 90. And then it takes somewhat less time to go down to 80. And then by the time it's down to 20, it's falling like a rock.
So I'm not imagining this.
No, you're not imagining it. What that means is basically the rate of discharge is non-linear with time. It's not going down 10% per 10 minutes. It's going down 10 and then 20 and then 30 and then 40. And that is, again, that's a ubiquitous thing about the nature of the universe. Systems are non-linear. Transistors are non-linear. Everyone knows this. Computers are made out of transistors, and computers have changing behavior with time. So computers are nonlinear dynamical systems. And despite that, like many engineering systems, the people that design them use linear mathematics largely. And that has served well for decades. And the reason that it has served well as across all of engineering is that linearity can be a pretty good approximation. It's like you're fitting a line to a curve. That's good for part of the curve. And if the curve is not very curvy, it's good for a large part of the curve. But at a certain point, your line is not going to fit your curve, and you're going to be up a creek.
Right.
And so nonlinear dynamics accounts for that, embraces it, and analyzes it. The problem is that it's very, very hard math. So all that is to say that the way computers use their memory, the way they use their CPUs, at this point, when we've been designing things to the hairy edge, we need to start using the mathematics of nonlinearity if we're going to understand things right. The downside of that is it's really hard, and there's not a whole lot of traction that you can get without really good data, just because the problem is so hard. And so we have showed that computers are nonlinear dynamical systems in the same sense that people in my field, they'll study a laser, they'll study an ice core, they'll study, something like that. And they'll say, look, it has thus and such Lyapunov exponent, which means that it's thus and such predictable. We can use all those techniques on computers, and we can show that you change the hardware a little bit, the dynamics change. You change the software a little bit, the dynamics change, in all the classic senses. And I would love to be able to go to the computer systems community and say something other than, what you're doing is wrong, and it's too hard to do what you should be doing right. It's just too hard. And that's not a very popular concern.
Yeah.
So we haven't gotten there yet, basically because the analysis techniques from my field are just so hard to use. But the problem is that beyond a certain point, if you are using linear techniques to analyze a nonlinear system, you are looking for your keys under the lamppost. And so I don't quite know how to get beyond that, but that's a current research topic. I'm not working on that really hard right now because I did encounter the challenge of coming into another community and saying, I didn't say it this way, but this is how it probably came across of, well, you guys are using the wrong math and the right math is just too hard. Not popular.
So you say the right math is too hard. So I guess like if you had an unlimited budget or unlimited ability to convince people that you're right, what would a research program look like in this area?
It's not about money. It's about access to the data. And the challenge is not, oh, if I just had better sensors. The problem is that there are too many things you need to measure. Mm-hmm. And the act of measuring them may affect the system. So imagine if I wanted to measure the voltage on every transistor in your computer. That, first of all, would be impossible. And even if it were possible, it would change the way your computer operates.
Right.
So there are fundamental problems. And also, you need just so much length of data to get anything right. And the mathematics of nonlinear dynamics also makes the very utopian assumption of stationarity. Not that the system doesn't change, but that the way the system changes is the same each time it goes through that state. And computers aren't like that.
So I don't totally understand how quantum computers work, but this seems almost like a similar idea in some ways, no?
I don't completely understand how quantum computers work either, unfortunately.
But I guess the challenge of measuring something that will change its state.
That you're right. There is a similar smell there. I think it comes from a different reason, but
right.
It's very hard to reconcile nonlinear dynamics and quantum physics because nonlinear dynamics makes the assumption that the world is deterministic, that cause and effect are linked, and that things are nonlinear. Quantum physics makes the assumption that at the basic level things are linear and stochastic, as opposed to nonlinear and deterministic. And those are flip sides of the coin. These are two fundamentally different ways of thinking about the world that may both be right in some strange way. These are hard things to wrestle with. But no, I'll think about what you said. I think there's yeah. And speaking of two sides to one thing, that brings me to something else you mentioned that you wanted to talk about, which is chaos versus complexity. Mm-hmm. So chaos and complexity are often lumped together, and indeed there are many people that like to think about both of those things. Melanie Mitchell on our council is one of those people. The Santa Fe Institute, with which Melanie and I are both affiliated, is a place that likes to think about both of those things. Chaos is complicated behavior from simple systems. So if you just have a pendulum clock, but the wall is wiggling, the pendulum can move chaotically. That's chaos, complicated behavior from a possibly simple nonlinear system. Complexity science is all about very simple behavior coming from complicated systems. So an example of that is a school of fish or a flock of birds. Maya Matarich, who's another council member, did her PhD on a robotics application of this 30 years ago. So you have individual agents, each of whom is very simple, and they're all interacting. So in some sense, the system is very complicated. You have 10,000 fish or 1 million birds, and each of them, again, operating under simple local rules. There's no conductor bird or conductor fish that says, you guys go here and you come here. Everybody is operating based on a local view of the world. And from that emerges, I'm making air quotes that you can't see in a podcast, but emerges some global phenomenon like a school of fish or a flock of birds. And probably you've seen the gorgeous videos of starlings, the murmuration videos. Those are all just individual birds operating under 3 or 4 rules. Don't get too close to the bird next to you, don't get too far, and go in the same direction. And if you have those 3 things, and don't bump into anything, 4 things, then from that local behavior of 10,000 birds, you get the flock coming together and moving and running away from the hawk. So simple behavior from complicated systems, complicated behavior from simple systems. Those are chaos, complexity and chaos. I had them backwards. Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like taking the metro a lot, I kind of see that. Mm-hmm. Right. That's a similar kind of thing. Don't run into the people.
Yep.
Get to your train.
Yep. But you're looking at the signs, and you have a global intent. You're trying to get to a particular place. Imagine if you were just walking in a crowd, a crowd at a protest on the mall or something like that, and you didn't have any ulterior motive except don't bump into the person next to you, don't get too far from them, and walk in the same direction. A parade would emerge.
Yeah, I guess that's true. Should try it out sometime. So you're more focused on chaos rather than complexity.
Yes.
And I interviewed Melanie Mitchell, that episode is out, about her work with complexity with the Santa Fe Institute. Mm-hmm. So does the Santa Fe Institute also do work on chaos?
Yes.
So what kind of programs are available?
So the Santa Fe Institute is a think tank. I don't know if you and Melanie talked about it, but it has only a very few permanent faculty. It's mostly a visiting institution that brings in, it's kind of like a CCC with a campus and big endowment. Not big enough, but so the Santa Fe Institute was the home for a tremendous amount of the very early work on chaos theory, including the foundation for this nonlinear time series analysis that I use a lot, including a wonderful project on, well, they also work on what's called econophysics. Think about like the stock market and then doing this kind of analysis on it. So there's a tremendous amount of early work on nonlinear dynamics and chaos that happened there. In terms of programs, the Santa Fe Institute has a wonderful summer REU site program, and it has a bunch of wonderful summer schools, one of which Melanie and I both teach at.
And that's in person or?
Yes,
remote?
That's in person. And they also have MOOCs. There's a MOOC platform called Complexity Explorer, of which Melanie was the architect, and she teaches a fabulous course on complexity through that MOOC, and I teach one on chaos.
Okay. I know, like, within popular culture, chaos theory is occasionally brought up. Do you have any thoughts on sort of the portrayal of chaos theory within popular culture? How accurate is it? Or like butterfly effect?
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
Some of it's, metaphors are very useful in getting people to understand things. And the butterfly effect is a very useful metaphor. One of the more interesting pop culture manifestations of chaos theory was in Jurassic Park. I don't know if you remember this. There was a scientist who was modeled after one of the people in my field who kept kind of saying obnoxious things about chaos theory.
This is Jeff Goldblum's character?
Yes. But it actually wasn't bad. It wasn't bad. So some of it's good. When I see books on like the chaos theory of management, I think about Dilbert. So, this goes back to my the things that I said about application of nonlinear dynamics to computer performance. To really know that it's okay to use this mathematics, you need to know a lot about the system, and it has to satisfy a whole bunch of conditions. And a business does not satisfy that condition. There's just no way. That being said, you can be a real hard person and say, well, none of it applies. But sometimes you see things happening in the real world that suggest that that's what's going on under the hood, that there is chaotic dynamics going on, but there's no way you would be able to satisfy the givens of the theorems. And so I don't think that we should be hardcore mathematicians and say, well, we should only think about this and only care about it when we're absolutely sure that we have enough information to say for sure that it's happening. So there's a spectrum, and I think a lot of people have heard of the butterfly effect, and that's a very useful metaphor. So if the butterfly can set off a hurricane, right? So you have a butterfly in Tokyo, and he flaps his wings, or she, and the hurricane hits, El Cabo, whatever. Where do you put the butterflies to steer the hurricane? And so I did some work on that with laboratory fluid dynamics, which was really hard, and so I kind of backed out of that too.
So there's actually some theoretical work out there that suggests this could really be possible?
Oh, yeah. There's my PhD thesis and a couple of other at the time, and there's been a bunch of papers there about control of chaos. And again, but you need perfect knowledge.
Right.
Almost. With the mathematicians, one of the things that I did a little differently, mathematicians were, well, if you have perfect knowledge, you can figure this out. And I tried to fuzz that out so that it would still work even if you didn't have perfect knowledge. So that's how I got into the field.
What would be the minimum number of butterflies required to stop a hurricane if you had perfect knowledge?
It depends completely. And I'm sorry that's not a satisfying answer, but it depends on how swirly the hurricane is.
Okay.
What we were working on was basically kind of like a fuel injector in a car. Mm-hmm. So you've got a jet, which is one fluid squirting into another. And we were messing around with the nozzle geometry with little kind of adaptations, little micro electromechanical systems, little flaps. and trying to figure out how to inject little packets of vorticity into the flow and then let the butterfly effect kind of amplify those. So we were looking for the places where the flow is ticklish, and we wanted to inject our little taps at the right place to make a given thing happen downstream. And that was really hard.
Have you done any work with measurement systems? Because you say most of these systems you require perfect information or near perfect. So have you done any, or do you know of any work sort of that aim to give us perfect information or better information about these kind of things?
Well, the technology that we used in the work on flow control is called particle image velocimetry. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like motion capture for a fluid flow. You seed the flow with particles, and then you take a bunch of pictures really close. Click, 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 like you flash, 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 flash. And then you watch how that each particle moves through the flow, and that tells you what the pattern is, what the vectors are that describe the flow. And that's, $100,000 worth of equipment and lasers and, again, post-processing. So that's the most powerful measurement technology I've ever used. And even then, you don't get perfect information because you only know where the particles went that you put in the flow, and there could be something different happening in between them.
Right.
So there's also the issue with whenever you are gathering data with a device hooked to a computer, the computer is every now and then going to go like flush its caches or whatever, and you might miss a whole bunch of stuff. And then there's the other issue that we talked about before, which is when you measure something, sometimes you change it. It's Heisenberg, right? You observe something, you change it. So I don't think we're ever going to have perfect measurements. Then there's the notion of perfect model, which we're also never going to have, because the notion of a model, the whole point of a model is George Box's famous quote, "All models are wrong, but some are useful." A model is an imperfect description of something. It's good enough for some purpose, but it's not perfect. Like if I were describing, well, I'll leave it at that. There's no way to perfectly describe the natural world unless you're near the center of a black hole or something. Seriously.
Yeah, that's true. So related to the concept of modeling, you're also involved with AI, and you sort of helped to lead the recent CCC AI roadmap.
Yep.
So how did you go from electrical engineering to AI?
So my PhD thesis I did in the MIT AI lab. And when I described it as kind of doing the control of chaos, but kind of trying to fuzz it up a bit so it would work even if you didn't have perfect information, what I built was a computer program that could control chaotic systems. And that's an intelligent thing because control theory people like to think of this as a hard thing that people like to do. So it was an artificial intelligence of a sort. When CCC decided to do the roadmap, I was probably the closest person on the council to AI. And so that became a large part of my job for the past year. And it was actually really rewarding. It was really hard, but it was really rewarding, not the least because it allowed me to tie together some of the things that are really early and formative to me with my technical endeavors. I mentioned that my mother was a social worker. I went to a school in New York City called the Ethical Culture Fieldston School. So ethics are extremely important to me, and ethics in AI is a huge issue. And so I was able to bring together those two pieces of two things that are very important to me, and that felt very rewarding.
So the AI roadmap is out now, but for people who are listening to this, can you kind of summarize some of the key recommendations or findings that are presented in the roadmap?
Right. So the roadmap is a big document written by a bunch of people with input from 100 and some more. So it's hard to get agreement between any 2 or 3 people, let alone 150. But I think the findings are interesting. Many of them are obvious. AI has had huge impact, but there are things we need to worry about and need to think about, need to get ahead of. There are issues now. It used to be that all AI research happened in computer science departments, and now we have an industry AI ecosystem. And so there's these two ecosystems that have grown up separately, the industry and the academia. They have different drivers, they have different opportunities, they have different incentives, they have different timelines. And so there's a little bit of a disjunction between these two kinds of organizations. And I think that, and the AI roadmap had this as a finding, that we need to bridge that gap because we need industry. We need the data that they have, the cloud power that they have, the person power that they have, and the innovation that happens there. But we also need fundamental academic foundations. And right now, there's not a good substrate on which to bring those together. And a lot of the recommendations of the roadmap are about that, are about making that happen.
Okay.
And also there are lots of recommendations about, you need to think about ethics and...
Right. So as far as ethics in AI, what kind of things do you think are necessary for more ethical deployment?
Well, we need to define what we mean by ethical deployment first. And there are other people on the CCC that know a lot about that, including Suresh, with whom you talked. That's not my technical field, so I don't know much about how you define that, but I know that when I talk to those folks, they say, oh gosh, first we need to define it. So that's one issue. We need to understand what we mean by bias, because there are systems that are fed this data, and the data have bias in them, but we don't know that, and then the systems learn the bias, and we say, oh my goodness. And so it's kind of like a bit of a whack-a-mole game. These things, they do something bad, and we say, oh, we should fix that. And they do something else bad, and we should fix that. So I think we need a really systematic approach to definitions of either, well, there's different ways to think about this. Do you want to be quote-unquote fair, or do you want to not have unintended consequences, or do you want, what does ethics mean anyway? And I guess that's one of the outcomes of going to a school called the Ethical Culture School, that you never actually figure that out. You just keep wrestling.
Yeah, I mean, I guess philosophy has been struggling with these questions for all of human recorded history, so...
And law, of social sciences. I talk to my lawyer friends, and they say, well, we need a definition of fairness, and they say, and their jaws drop. It's like, we've been trying to do that for 100 years, So it's a hard one. And it's also scary because, once you release code into the world, it's there forever. And so the systems, the AI systems that we're building today and releasing into the world with all of their blemishes and problems are going to be there for forever. And we need to not only figure out how to de novo make these things better, but also retroactively retrofit them. Somehow go back with software that looks at existing systems and at least lets us know if they're wrong or bad, but then we need definitions of wrong and bad. Someone brought this up at the meeting today. It would be nice to be able to know what attribute of yourself you would have had to change to get that loan.
Yeah.
Or what we call counterfactual analysis. If I were a person of color, I'd just change one attribute in my data. How would that change all these things? So it's kind of like an input-output analysis or a sensitivity analysis. You're kind of poking the thing and see what it does. That's about all we can do right now.
Yeah, I think David Parks mentioned that because that was one of the big topics at the economics and fairness workshop, was making algorithms in some way accountable so that you could understand what was going on in them. And not just accountable, but...
transparent, accountable, explainable. Yeah, but those are all... And this is a problem because one of the responses to calls for making an algorithm explainable or transparent, say a judge or a politician wants the algorithm to be transparent. A computer scientist says, well, here's the code. That's not useful with machine learning because the code is not the be-all and end-all. The code learns patterns from data. You need the code and the data, and then you need, it's a big mathematical function that fits something. And there's no way to, well, there are ways, but it's hard to pull apart the input to output relationship. That is, what does this one thing do to the output?
In your opinion, do you see this as more of a policy question or a sort of research culture?
Both. Intertwined. And we need people not attacking this separately and then talking. We need people attacking it together. We need the social scientists and the legal scholars and the jurists and the political philosophers in the trenches with the computer scientists figuring this out.
Let me ask you one more thing. Oh, because someone sent a leak out today about the Uber self-driving car crash. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about that. It seems like there were some issues in terms of how their code dealt with information that they were unsure about. Basically, if they didn't know what it was, they recategorized it, meaning that every time it didn't know, it kept going back to the first level, trying to understand it and not stopping. So I guess, do you have any thoughts about self-driving cars or other AI systems being deployed in situations like that?
I didn't have a chance to read the Uber thing very carefully, but Melanie Mitchell has some great examples about this. And also, my very first PhD student, Reinhard Stolle, is second in command of Audi's autonomous vehicles division.
Okay.
So I know a little bit about it, but it's all secondhand. And I guess I would say there are corner cases. So you can have code that does pretty well at most of the things that a car needs to do. But then you find that there's a situation where a ball rolls into the street. And you and I would immediately worry that there was a kid behind it. That has to be programmed in. You have to program into your autonomous vehicle, if you see a ball, worry about a kid behind it. And you can imagine that there might be millions of these corner cases that you and I would just know, but that a computer would have to be told. Computers do exactly what we tell them, but that means we have to tell them everything. And so I think that autonomous vehicles, I guess to back up, I think we hold autonomous vehicles to a much higher standard than we hold human drivers. I think if people get upset when they hear that an autonomous vehicle hurts someone, when they don't get upset when they hear that a person driving hurts someone. So there's that perception problem too. It's like, getting worried about bitten by a shark versus getting worried about being hit by a drunk driver. One of those is a heck of a lot more common. So there's that issue too. But in terms of the technology, I think it'll get there, but there are always going to be those corner cases. And if people's consideration of the results of those corner cases isn't modulated rationally, that could hold up this technology in inappropriate ways.
Yeah, I think in this particular situation, it was a woman crossing the street, not at a crosswalk, holding a bike. So the car didn't know if it was a bike or a person or another thing. But yeah. But
you could imagine that it should be programmed to just stop if it doesn't know what to do. But Reinhard told me about the issues there is he's designing cars that are on the German Autobahn. If you put a loop in the code that says, if you don't know what's going on, stop, that's dangerous. On the German Autobahn, you'll get killed. You'll kill other people. So it's not so simple. Like many things that we do, and this is part of Melanie's wonderful recent book, common sense reasoning, things that you and I just do, we don't even think about doing, is the hardest thing for computers to do because you have to tell them everything. So
you're currently the vice chair of the CCC Council, but in July, you'll take over as chair. Do you have any sort of future thoughts about the CCC's direction? Putting you on the spot, so you don't have to have anything.
No, that's fine.
But
I'm an idealist, and I'm sure that will come through in the things that I hope the CCC will do. I think it will be absolutely, positively critical that we do as much as we can to educate policymakers about the landscape of computing in general and AI in particular, to the point where they can make sensible decisions about policy. And so I think many of us in computer science could do very well to do things like the CCC's Leadership in Science Policy Institute, the LISPI, and learn how to really effectively talk to what Ken Forbes calls Congress critters. So I think outreach and education, especially, this is a tough time. Things are changing under our feet, and disinformation, misinformation is a real issue. And, sometimes I feel like we unleashed this computer internet thing on the world, and so it's incumbent upon us to do what we can to at least damp out the bad bits.
Yeah, so I'm not sure exactly when this will come out, but it's being recorded in November 2019. So all of these landscape things could potentially change before people hear about them. But yeah, thank you for being here. Any final thoughts?
Nope. I think this is great. I've loved being on the CCC, and I encourage people to find out more about it and look at our website and come to our events and get engaged with your policymakers.
Sounds good. Well, have a good night. That's it for today's podcast. Remember to like, subscribe, and rate us 5 stars on iTunes. Till next time, peace.